Newsmaker Sunday with Fox 10's John Hook.
I am announcing today that my service in the Senate will conclude at the end of my term in early January 2019.
That came like a bolt out of the blue. Some people saw the handwriting on the wall, but many didn't, and in that fashion, it was a moment. Arizona Senator Jeff Flake is our guest this week on Fox 10 Newsmaker Sunday. Great to see you.
Hey, great to be here.
That moment when you made that announcement, I mean, this is a job I'm sure that it's coveted.
It is.
It is, to many, the greatest job in Washington.
Yeah. For good reason.
Did that pain you greatly?
Yeah. I mean, the Senate is an incredible place. I'm not leaving because I'm sour on the Senate or sour on the Congress or government in general. It's an incredible job. It's an incredible honor to be only the 11th senator in Arizona history. It's a great job. It really is. And I've enjoyed it. I felt I've made a difference. And so I'm not leaving for that reason at all.
Let's roll the next tape, which is tape number 2. When you made your statement, you talked quite a bit about the tonality in Washington. The president, pretty direct. I mean, you didn't name him outright, but everybody knew who you were talking about. Take a look.
I've decided that I would be better able to represent the people of Arizona and to better serve my country and my conscience by freeing myself of the political consideration that consumed far too much bandwidth and would cause me to compromise far too many principles.
That was probably the lightest part of it. There were some pretty strong broadsides. Donald Trump tweeting out the reason Flake and Corker dropped out of the Senate race is very simple. They had zero chance of being elected. Now act, so hurt and wounded. This is exactly what you've been talking about, and you talk about it in your book, Conscience of a Conservative. This is part 2, because Barry Goldwater, of course, penned a book of the same title in 1960 before his presidential run in '64. When you saw the president's tweet, not unexpected, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I expected it. You know, when the president, even before he ran, when he promoted the very ugly conspiracy theory about Barack Obama not being born in the country, and I spoke out at that time. And when he announced his campaign and talked about Mexican rapists coming across the border, I spoke out then. And then when he belittled John McCain's military record and talked about the judge born in Indiana as a Mexican in a pejorative way.
That he couldn't be fair.
Yeah, they couldn't be fair. I mean, I thought at that time, somebody's got to stand up and say, this is not us. This shouldn't be our party. And I still feel that way.
Is your quarrel with the president tonality or policy? Because you have voted with him quite a bit, 95%.
I'm a conservative, and when he puts forward conservative policies, or conservative judges, for example, and personnel to vote for, I'll vote for them. I'm not doing anything out of spite, but there are policies that I disagree with, certainly. Withdrawal from the TPP or Trans-Pacific Partnership will have lasting damage to us in terms of our economy and our geopolitical position in the world. Getting out of NAFTA, we are in the process of perhaps withdrawing from that. That would be tremendously damaging.
We know.
So I disagree on the policy, and I certainly disagree on the tone and behavior.
If we know one thing about Donald Trump, it's all pretty much written out in The Art of the Deal. Everything is an extreme position to start with, and then you haggle and bargain from there. Yeah. Even though he says some of this stuff, is it just an opening position, say, on NAFTA, where he will try to drive a better deal for the American worker?
Perhaps a better deal on NAFTA, but let me tell you where tone and language makes a difference. With Mexico, when you come out and you have an absurd position, we're going to build a wall and they're going to pay for it. That's just a way to demean Mexican citizens. And when you talk about Mexican rapists crossing the border or tweet out crime statistics in Mexico just to irk them, what you do there is you affect Mexican politics and make Mexican politics much more anti-American. You may give way to a socialist or a populist leader coming forward. And then what do? Then we have tremendous problems with Mexico.
Right.
And that makes a difference. So it's not just your policies that you adapt. The language makes a difference as well.
Let's roll tape number 3. This is also from your announcement. Take a look.
Because politics can make us silent when we should speak, and silence can equal complicity. I have children and grandchildren to answer to, And so, Mr. President, I will not be complicit or silent.
And one of the great honors of my life, to have the opportunity to serve with a man of integrity, of honor, and decency, and commitment to not only Arizona, but the United States of America.
How did you feel when John McCain stood up and said those words?
I can tell you, I have tremendous admiration for John McCain, for what he's done, certainly as a prisoner of war, and what he's done in the United States Senate, and that he continues to speak out. So it was emotional for me, certainly, to hear him say that.
How did we end up in Arizona, a reliably, predictably red state,
Right,
with 2 U.S. senators who are perhaps the biggest thorns in Donald Trump's side? How did that happen?
You know, Arizona, we are an independent bunch out here. We don't go along to get along, and certainly Barry Goldwater and others have proved that. And
It's that libertarian streak, right,
yeah,
that runs
yeah,
pretty deep.
But also, I think, a decent streak as well. When I look back at state politics, people in the past like Stan Turley, actually an uncle of mine, and Jake Flake, another uncle of mine in the state legislature. And you see, you know, we've gone through fits and starts as well, but this is a decent place where people certainly argue politics, but in the end, it ought to be you know, with decency, and we haven't seen that in the White House, and that troubles, I think, all of us.
Do you understand, though, as a politician, you realize that this guy tapped into 54 million people who are so upset with the status quo that they said, the plain-spoken guy, I understand when he's talking to me. You understand that appeal?
I do. I understand the
Is there a genius to it?
Well, if all you're looking for is to get office, but if you actually want to accomplish something, then you realize that you can't refer to people on the other side of the aisle as losers or clowns and expect to actually then sit down and write legislation with them, or to forward legislation. So I'm concerned that, you know, the politics of anger and resentment just aren't a governing philosophy. They can help win elections, certainly, but then when you have to do the tough business of governing, we have some tough issues to solve over the next couple of decades, and they won't be solved by just, you know, resorting to our camps and not working together.
I want to play tape number 5. This is Donald Trump reacting to your announcement on the Senate floor that you weren't going to seek a second term. Take a look.
Very high in Arizona. I love the people. They like me. They like security at the border, you know, all of the things. But I think I'm probably helped greatly in Arizona by what happened with Senator Flake.
I would say to that, be careful what you wish for, because you have a Republican seat that you held. You're the incumbent. It's very hard to unseat an incumbent. And now the whole race is in chaos on the Republican side.
Well, it's certainly up in the air right now.
Is there anyone you will support in that race? And could you vote for the Republican nominee, or would you lean toward Kyrsten Sinema?
I'm staying out of that completely. I have 14 months still in the Senate to get a lot of things done, and I plan to.
Would you
to focus on politics
would you
right now
campaign for the eventual nominee?
It depends on who the nominee is and if I feel strongly enough and if they want my help. So a lot of things depend on who it is and what they're talking about.
You wrote this book, Conscience of a Conservative.
That's what Donald Trump called it, a horrible book, I think. I'm not sure what kind of endorsement that is. But he said that I wrote it long before I knew him. Not quite.
This is an easier way to navigate the waters. Put it up in a full still, but the rejection of destructive politics and the return to principle. You wrote it in secret. Nobody really knew you were doing it. Cheryl, your lovely wife, knew you were writing it.
She did.
Your publishers had to know it was coming.
Right.
When I saw this dropped, I thought, I don't know that Jeff Flake can survive this politically in Arizona in a primary. When you wrote it, did you know I'm probably not going to run?
Well, like I said, I knew during the campaign that I was out of step with some of my Republican colleagues and certainly the electorate. But I felt that somebody had to stand up. And in terms of the timing of a book, I could have waited until I was safely reelected, but then it wouldn't mean as much. It doesn't mean much if there's nothing at stake. And I felt that somebody had to stand up and say something.
Let me read a quote from the book, because this gets at, I think, the heart of it. You say, never has a party so quickly or so easily abandoned its principles as my party did during the 2016 campaign, because it was quick and easy and the real world is hard.
That's right. It's easy for a politician to point to a shuttered factory and to blame NAFTA, free trade agreement, or globalization, when it's a lot more complex than that. Automation, mechanization. You know, we manufacture twice what we did in the 80s with 1/3 fewer workers. So people are displaced. There are those issues. But the first thing that we ought to do as conservatives is at least tell the truth. Say, these are tough issues. These are complex issues. Here's where we need to go, instead of just blaming or scapegoating certain individuals or certain things.
You were critical of Donald Trump. So was Mitt Romney. Really blasted him in that speech in the middle of the campaign, toward the latter part, the last third. Is this an LDS thing, a Mormon thing, where it just, his tone violates your sensibilities of public discourse and what it should be?
Well, let me just say, the church that I belong to never tells me how to vote or what to say
I'm not insinuating
anything.
that. But just you're raised in that environment. It's part of your DNA.
Yeah, it is, I think. We're told to be involved and to be engaged. My father was a mayor of Snowflake. My uncle Jake in the state legislature and Speaker of the House. We've been involved. But I've seen in Arizona behavior, you know, decent behavior modeled in state politics and local politics, because people realize you've got to get along. You've got to get things done. Labels of Democrat or Republican don't mean as much at the local level. And I've seen that behavior modeled, and certainly my faith as well. You want to be decent, and there's nothing to be gained by vitriol.
Now that you're unencumbered in the Senate, you don't have to worry about re-election. Let's roll tape number 8 with taxes out there. You voted with the president on the repeals of Obamacare. You voted with him quite a bit. But now that you're free, you, Bob Corker, people who've been in the Senate, has he burned so many bridges that something like tax reform might be in jeopardy just because of the relationship falling apart with you guys?
Well, let me just say, I voted not so much with the president on health care. I voted 30 times to repeal and replace Obamacare.
So it had not much to do with him. It had to do with the concept.
And most of what we voted on so far is just personnel and whatnot. And he nominated some good judges, which I've been pleased to support. When the president puts forward good policy, I'll be with him. I'll oppose him when it's wrong.
You'll
but
still
with regard to tax, oh, you bet, you bet. And with regard to taxes, my concern is the president keeps talking about cuts, cuts, cuts. He wanted to call it the cut bill. We're talking about needing tax reform. Sure, that involves tax cuts, but it also involves broadening the base, getting rid of tax credits and loopholes and deductions. And we've got to do that, or it won't have my vote.
Senator, why, you're a fiscal conservative, why in the world are we not having a conversation about cutting spending? Nobody talks about it. Now, you don't have to run. You can be very honest with folks. This is about getting reelected, right? You start cutting programs, you lose votes.
Well, I think that's why the president, during the campaign, said he wasn't going to talk about entitlement reform. Now, on the discretionary side, whether it's defense spending or education, infrastructure, we've been pretty flat over the past several years. We got rid of earmarks, and there are a lot of the ugly kind of spending.
Yeah.
But on the entitlement side, my goodness, our mandatory spending just continues to climb.
But that's most of the budget.
That is, and the president, during the campaign, and that was part of the problem I had with him, is he said, that's off the table, not going to touch it. And we've held to that. And the problem is when one party controls, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, both chambers in the White House, that party will never do the big things needed to put us back on track, because you share all the blame. Look with the Democrats and Obamacare. They got it through, but it lost them more than any other issue 3 or 4 elections in the future.
With not a single Republican vote.
Exactly, and that's why Republicans don't want to do this, and Democrats aren't anxious to help. We're dealing with tax reform right now. Just look back to 1986. The last major tax reform, and it was tough. It gored a lot of oxes.
Sure.
I mean, it really did.
Ronald Reagan.
You know how many votes it got in the Senate? 97. 97 votes, because the parties decided at that time, let's share whatever credit is there, but more importantly, let's share the political risk. And now that seems like a galaxy far, far away. When you have the president Just yesterday, for example, when the terrorist attack in New York, coming out or a couple of days ago and blaming Chuck Schumer for the diversity visa program, which Chuck Schumer and I and Dick Durbin and a few others proposed to get away, to do away with in the so-called Gang of Eight bill. But it does make it more difficult for the president to get cooperation when he's calling people losers and clowns. It just does.
When we come back, he's written the book Conscience of a Conservative, and we'll put it up here on the screen as well. And a conversation coming up about, and I think you put it in the book, the Republican Party is in its death throes. Is that accurate? Was that about what you said?
Similar to that.
If that's true, I'm going to ask Senator Flake why Republicans are controlling state legislatures across the country, governorships, the House, the Senate on the federal level, and the presidency. Back in a moment with Arizona Senator Jeff Flake. Back on Fox 10 Newsmaker Sunday with Arizona Senator Jeff Flake, who, as you know, announced a couple of weeks ago in a shocker that he will not seek a second term for the U.S. Senate. What are you going to do with this last, how many months do you have?
14.
14 months, thank you. Will you be an outspoken guy challenging the president in his tone and in policy? Where do you see your role?
Well, I like to think I haven't been anything else. I have spoken up over the past several months to the consternation of the president sometimes when we disagree. But yeah, I'll speak up, but I'm not going to do things out of spite. I'm going to continue to stand up for what I believe in. The first thing I'm going to be doing is trying to get through an AUMF, or authorization for use of military force. We're still operating on a 16-year-old authorization, and it allows the Congress to blame the president, whether the president's Republican or Democrat, if things go wrong with some operation overseas, and it's just not right. So Tim Kaine and I, senator from Virginia,
vice presidential nominee.
Right. We've been working on this for several years, back when President Obama was president, and we just had a hearing last week with Mattis and Tillerson, and we're going to mark up the bill in early December.
The book you wrote, Conscience of a Conservative, and it's out now, and you really kind of, you reflect on where the party is, the problems with going down the road of supporting somebody, in your view, Donald Trump, who you don't believe, I don't think, is worthy of the office. You say in the book, we pretended that the emperor wasn't naked. Even worse, we checked our critical faculties at the door and pretended that the emperor was making sense.
Right.
This is a pretty strong takedown of the president. Could you have written this book if you weren't at 18% in the polls? In other words, if you were in a competitive environment where you might have been able to win, could you have done what you did?
Oh, probably not. Probably not. I mean, like I said, I put myself out of step with many in the party back during the 2016 campaign when I challenged some of the president's statements and some of his policies. And you know, the hope is always that you know, the fever will cool as you get closer to an election, but it hasn't. In fact, if you look right now, the vast majority of Republican primary voters, those that matter in this instance, being nominated, are right there with the president. And their number one issue, according to some polls, is, are you with the president?
You sound like Grant Woods a little bit, the former Attorney General, who says, I didn't really leave the party left me. And I've heard that quote a lot in the last year or so.
Well, you know, I do think that the fever will cool, because like I said, this anger and resentment is not a way to govern. You just can't govern that way. And we're going to have to get back to principles that I think have animated the party for generations. In particular, you know, this notion that if you want to demean somebody in a Republican primary, you call them a globalist. Well, what's the alternative? We are in a global society in terms of trade and market opportunities. If we don't trade, we don't grow. We're only 5% of the world's population, only 20% of the world's economic output, and shrinking. Not because our economy is shrinking, but the developing world is growing faster. If we don't trade, we don't grow. And this notion that we can put up protectionist barriers to trade and succeed and prosper is just wrong. But I will concede that it's more popular. You know, free trade never fares well in a campaign. But typically, you do the campaign, and then you kind of, you know, in a lame duck session or whatever, you approve TPA, give the president trade authority, and you do the things that you need to. But this is, you had both parties, Republicans and Democrats this time, against trade. And that's why I say we checked our critical thinking faculties and said this makes sense, and we know it doesn't.
Exactly what you're describing, though, is I think what voters were railing against. That a politician will say something, then they'll do something else. And so there was something about Trump that captured, again, 54 million people voted for the guy. Something in that message was resonating.
Oh, you bet. Like I said, it is popular in a campaign.
And in a campaign, dangerous?
It does, because populism is called populism for a reason. It is popular. And you can win campaigns, you know, by riling up the base and others. California saw this during 1994 with Prop 187.
Pete Wilson.
Pete Wilson, winning a second term. And he riled up the base big time
on immigration.
Illegal aliens and benefits. And it did drive out turnout. And he won a second term. And there's only been one Republican elected statewide in California since.
This gets into
Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that's why I look and when I say that sometimes you look at a rally that Donald Trump is having and see just white, older men, for the most part, there, and you think that is the spasms of a dying party. When you look at demographics, I very much subscribe to the autopsy that the Republican Party did after the Mitt Romney loss, where we said, you know, we've got to appeal to a broader base. And our message of entrepreneurship and low regulations and taxes should appeal to immigrants and Hispanics who are starting their own businesses and are succeeding. But the problem is the rhetoric and the tone we use doesn't let us even get in the door to talk to them.
And we talked about this going into the break. Yet the party is dominating, I think it's 32 states in terms of having both houses, the House and the Senate, governorships in 30 or more, the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and the presidency. If the Republican Party is so adrift, how come they're winning so many elections?
Well, I can tell you that part of it, and a big part of it right now, is the Democrats have gone to the extreme as well. When you have Bernie Sanders, you know, a self-described socialist,
who might have won had there not been a lot of monkey business,
and so close to winning, and now the energy of the Democratic Party is on the left fringe with, you know, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and so I think it's given Republicans a bit of a reprieve electorally, because the Democratic Party has gone so far left. They will recognize, they will realize at some point. I just hope we, in the Republican side, the conservative side, recognize it more quickly and capture more of the center, because we can't govern this way.
The book is called Conscience of a Conservative, The Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. The author is Jeff Flake, Arizona's junior senator, who announced 2 weeks ago he will not seek a second term. We're going to talk about that decision and what's next for Jeff Flake when we come back on Newsmaker Sunday. Final moments with Arizona Senator Jeff Flake. What will you miss most about the U.S. Senate?
Oh, the people. They're a good bunch of people on both sides of the aisle. One thing, a myth I'd like to dispel, is that we're all at each other's throats all the time. We're not. There are a group of people who I think, given the right leadership, would actually sit down and fix some of the big issues.
Is Washington past the point of no return, or are you hopeful?
No, there are strong institutions in Washington, and they will survive. They'll outlast the foibles of people like me who go through the system.
Does Trump?
This is a good system we have here.
Does Donald Trump survive the presidency? Do you believe that? You got 10 seconds.
I think he'll probably stand for re-election. I don't think he'll be re-elected.
Arizona Senator Jeff Flake, congratulations on the book, Conscience of a Conservative, Part 2, really, and drawing back on Barry Goldwater heavily, who I know was an idol of yours. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I hope we have you back as the term ends.
Like that.
We'll see you next week on Newsmaker Sunday. Thank you, Senator.